This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. Communities across North Dakota can see big possibilities for education, infrastructure, conservation, and more. The state's oil and natural gas industry helps make them happen. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. My guest is Senator Kevin Cramer. Senator, how are you?
Well, I'm pretty well, thanks. Rob, I'm back in Bismarck. That's always good. It's always good to get back home, although I don't think I'm going to be here all that terribly long for a few weeks because we have two things coming up in the Senate. One is a budget battle. Because the Democrats have a 50-50 Senate and still a small majority in the House, they're probably going to try to utilize budget reconciliation, which I know you're familiar with. It's a tool that they can use with regard to spending and or tax issues that only requires a simple majority in the Senate. And they're going to evidently start debating on the floor already next week a budget resolution. You have to have a resolution that's passed by both the House and the Senate. It doesn't have to be signed by the President. And then once you have that, then you can start working on these other issues that they want to work on, like $2 trillion for COVID relief, because I don't know what, they haven't even started negotiating with Republicans yet. They're just going to go straight to that option. So, and then after that, of course, as you probably know, we have a jury trial for, the second impeachment of Donald Trump. And that's another 6-day-a-week, long day ordeal for the United States Senate. So it'll be crazy after this.
Well, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. I was just trying to buy some GameStop stock, and
were you? Yeah.
What a crazy thing that is. We're going to get into that other stuff you just talked about, but what?
Sure.
What is going on? Honestly, I don't like what's happening where they're shutting down. I don't know that I entirely understand. I understand what they're doing. I haven't decided yet if it's smart or not. I think there's a lot of people that are going to lose a lot of money, but I don't know. Maybe they're fine with it.
But
on the other hand, is this something that the federal government needs to step in on? Do we need to regulate it? I don't know that I like that they could just shut down the investing like this. That bothers me a little bit, Kevin.
So you're actually the perfect test market for this question. Sure. Because, and I think you and I are similar in this regard. We've talked about lots of these sort of things, right? Like, what I see this as is it's a way of using Reddit and the internet and these like-minded discussions, if you will, to for the populist movement, and this is sort of a populist, somewhere between the new Trump Republican populism and far left socialism, saying to the big Wall Street banks and investors, we can play your game too. And short selling is very tricky business, as you know. It's when an investor borrows shares and then sells them, and then of course they hope like heck when they buy them back later, it'll be a lower price. Well, these very clever amateurs, although they seem to be far better than amateurs, have put a real squeeze on the short investors, and that's what's at play here, Rob. But it's not without consequence, to your point. And so does government step in, or is this just capitalism at its rawest form? Will people get hurt? Almost certainly some people will probably get hurt. So I'm kind of like you. I'm watching it in real time wondering, oh my gosh, is this the coming together of the far left and the far right in a regulatory regime? Or do we let the winners and losers, run through the gauntlet and see who comes out the other side? Pretty scary, risky business.
I'm not gonna cry a lot of tears about hedge fund bear investors, who are placing short bets on companies, and it's sometimes. I have a love-hate relation. I understand the argument that shorts play a role in the marketplace and maybe weeding out truly bad companies that maybe should go out of business because their business model doesn't work anymore, or maybe their business model is built on a house of cards. Maybe that exists, but also, how much of it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy? As for what the Redditors and the people of the internet are doing, markets are based on people behaving rationally, right?
Right on.
So like when I go into the marketplace, I'm typically buying things I need or maybe just things I want, and I'm going to look around, and I mean the value of the thing is really based like I would really want like a big huge like movie screen size TV for my house with like super high def and all that, because I'm a gadget head and I just love to have that. But I'm not going to pay the price for it. So I'm going to settle for the lower definition, much smaller I mean, that's me behaving rationally in the market. I'm not in the market. What I want and what I can actually afford are two different things. So we rely on the market to behave rationally all the time, which is why we don't have to order that farmers grow crops that are in demand, right? The market sort of sends that with prices and everything else, sends that signal, hey, the market would like more of this, produce more of it, and it finds an equilibrium on its own. In this instance, you have people who are not behaving rationally, at least from a fiscal perspective. Politically, they may be behaving rationally, but fiscally, they are not. I mean, they have driven the stock up on GameStop to $300, but nothing about GameStop's business has changed. They're still a brick and mortar store selling a product that can be downloaded digitally. Right. That's a tough video games. You could just download video games now. So that hasn't changed, and yet now suddenly they're a hugely valuable company because of people's politics. And for me, I think that's going to flame out. Like they're going to make their point, but there's an upper limit on how much money people are willing to lose to make their point. And people might be, millions of people might be able to make their point buying a few stocks each, and maybe they're going to lose a couple $100 each. I don't know. But I have a feeling that we don't need to do anything. This is going to flame out. And then maybe it's lesson learned for the hedge fund people that lost money. I don't know. But to me, I think you let it ride out and it'll work itself out.
Yeah, so you've answered the question you've asked me, which I'm with you on this. But what's fun to watch is, I shouldn't say fun, but it's sort of amusing that you have people like Elizabeth Warren, who, as you know, I mean, I served with her on the banking committee. I mean, this is somebody who has made their life's work in Congress to destroy the large banks, and she's pretty good at it. And then you have somebody like Marsha Blackburn, who's a very conservative Republican member of the United States Senate, sort of on the same side, or at the very least, they feel the need to impose or intrude, or at the very least, investigate. I'm more like you. I'm more like, let's avoid the knee-jerk reaction, at least government, and see how this thing plays itself out, and then see if there's some intervention that's required later, or if the lesson is learned by the big hedge fund people. The problem is, to your point about rationality of markets, my friend and former North Dakotan, Dick Armey, when he was majority leader, and when he was an economics professor, used to have Armey's axioms, and one of them is, markets are rational, the government's dumb. And it's a great little axiom that makes all the sense in the world. But even markets can become irrational when there's an imbalance, or if there's government intervention. And so you look at the banking world, which is one of the most regulated worlds there is, but most regulations always benefit the large banks. And that's why things like Dodd-Frank, which was aimed at the bubble and the mortgage bubble that burst, is disproportionately harms small banks. Big banks have enough lawyers and enough accountants, and they can hire more if they need to work around all of those things. But the small banks can't, and all they do is add overhead, but not business. And so the best solution in all of this is the government shouldn't be so doggone involved in things in the first place. And if markets were truly free, remembering I was once a market regulator, for nearly 10 years, I set your electric rates and your gas rates. And in
an area that is not a free market, right? I mean, the power.
Not a free market, right?
I mean, it is a market, but boy, it's not very free.
It's not free. That's exactly right. And so anyway, I could go on a long thing as it relates to energy markets and how manipulated they are by regional transmission organizations, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, state public utility commissions like the North Dakota PSC. And I'm not saying that those don't have a role. They obviously do. When you give up market competition for a monopoly, you need to have some sort of regulation on that monopoly. But we're seeing that play out in lots of arenas. So back to the point of GameStop. GameStop and this situation we're watching play out in real time right now is a bit of an experiment. And I think we ought to sit back and see how the experiment works out and see if it works itself out before the government gets too excited about making a point.
At this point, the only thing that really concerns me, because if people want to lose money to make a political point, I'm not going to get in their way. Maybe we do that every year when we invest in political candidates who may or may not win. People spend a lot of money that they want to make a point, I guess. Go ahead. You're putting money in somebody else's pocket, but that's fine. That doesn't particularly bother me. I'm not crying the blues over people who placed bear bets and then lost them. Tough. Markets are risky. But the one thing that bothers me is we're just going to shut off trading for some of these companies. That was very troubling to me. That we can just say, well, we're not gonna allow you to suddenly trade in this publicly. Like, I don't think who gets to just make that choice? And how influenced is it by we're just protecting the big boys again? Because the little people are not behaving the way they should. Like, well, tough. Right?
Exactly right.
So the extent that there should be government intervention and all, I would like to explore that. I don't know that I support intervention, but boy, I would really like some questions answered about that.
Well, I'm certain there will be lots of investigations. There'll be lots of hearings, oversight hearings. Whether or not there's a outcome or a solution or an intervention beyond that, I don't know. But there's no doubt we'll have our opportunity to explore. What caused it, whether it's okay, what could be the potential outcomes, and if the outcome is, to your point, what we don't want is another huge regulation that prohibits normal people or retail investors from having access to stocks because it hurt a hedge fund. Clearly that's not the direction we want to go. But anyway, all of that, I've just exhausted everything I could possibly say about it, Rob, other than say there's going to be a lot more to watch.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on then. Impeachment. That's looming. You and I feel very differently about this. I am struggling, and to me, it's not just. There's obviously the impeachment question that's before the Senate, and I know as my Republican and conservative friends have been telling me ad nauseum on social media, Donald Trump shouldn't be convicted for this. I just disagree. I thought it was shameful what happened at the Capitol, and we don't need to go into all that because we've been over it a lot. There's no news there. I am worried about what if Republicans don't impeach Donald Trump, what that is going to unleash in terms of acceptable behavior from United States presidents. I don't think there's any question that Donald Trump pushed way beyond the norms of presidential behavior. And maybe in some ways that's okay. That's what a lot of people liked about him, is he didn't talk and he didn't sound. We've talked about that a ton. But I'm talking about real world consequences about what some of this rhetoric and some of his approach to politics is doing to the Republican Party and doing to this country. As most poignantly manifested in that riot at the Capitol, which is inciting it, is what he's been charged with. I don't think impeaching him after he's left office is unconstitutional. One of the powers Congress has is not just to remove somebody from office, but to bar them from running for office again. That could certainly happen. The person doesn't have to be in office for that. Nothing in the Constitution restrains Congress in that way, much as nothing in the Constitution restrains President Trump, if he had wanted to, from pardoning himself before he left office. So, maybe there should be constitutional limits, and I guess we could have an amendment debate, but the Constitution says what it says now. There's nothing, to me, there's nothing unconstitutional about this. Congress could do this, and maybe that's the first thing we should talk about. You obviously voted that you felt it was unconstitutional. Why?
Well, because Donald Trump's not the president, and when it comes to impeachment in the Constitution, and while you're right, there's nothing that restrains Congress. Well, thank goodness the Constitution would have been a very, very, very much longer document if everything that was going to constrain or restrain Congress from doing was to be printed. Instead, it says what Congress can do, and that's a much smaller document. And it says the president shall be removed. Well, the president is not Donald Trump. So, in Article 1, Section 3, it says when the president of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. Well, the Chief Justice isn't going to preside over this trial because the president isn't Donald Trump, and the president isn't being impeached. A former president or a private citizen is. Your other issue, the other issue is the Article 2 issue that you raised, and that is that the president shall be removed from office on impeachment for, and it lists, of course, and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, later in the text, it says that the president shall be removed, and then it also references may be, not, it says and not or, prohibited from serving in any other future office. And so while it doesn't speak directly to what you're restrained from doing, it says, your limits are these things, but it's not an or. It's not. Anyway, all that is textual, and there are constitutional lawyers on both sides of this issue, and I think that's safe.
I don't think it's so much unconstitutional. I think it's unprecedented. Like, it's never happened before.
Well, it is that, but a lot of things are unprecedented with this president. And there are precedents related to former office holders. I mean, William Blount, who was actually a signer of the Constitution and a United States senator, and was expelled from the Senate before he was impeached, objected to the legitimacy of the trial because, of course, he was now a private citizen, and the Senate did vote in that to dismiss him without a trial. So they found in his favor. But just as sure as that's true, William Belknap, who was Secretary of War and resigned, he was in fact impeached. But that question, there was actually a threshold vote on whether the Senate could remove somebody or impeach somebody who's no longer in office. It was just over 50-50 in the Senate. But it was neither one of those cases was ever brought beyond the Senate itself. So there's two instances in history, none of them with a president, one with a senator, one with a secretary of war, where the Senate itself voted on whether or not you could impeach a former officeholder. One time they said yes, another time they said no, but neither one ever went to a court. So anyway, again, there are constitutional lawyers on both sides of this, a good number of them actually. I've read a lot of it. But the ones that say that they believe it is constitutional, Rob, are very divided internally on it. In other words, they say yes, but barely. And I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So there seems to be a stronger emotional, intellectual argument against trying a private citizen versus,
and maybe that's not. I don't. When I look at that vote on Senator Rand Paul's motion, I just don't think the argument is as clear cut. Maybe, and I'm afraid that politics is dry. Which brings me to the other thing. Would you vote for conviction? And I mean, we're going ahead with it. Would you vote for conviction? I'm guessing I know the answer to this, but I want to answer the question. Would you vote?
Well, first of all, as I said many times, I don't default to conviction. I mean, not any jury in America should default to conviction prior to hearing evidence. Now, there isn't a lot of evidence in this one. All the evidence is very obvious. If you've watched the speech, you've read the tweets, you've seen the riots. I mean, I was there for all of it. I have seen all of that.
We all watched the people march from President Trump's rally to the Capitol.
That's right.
And start doing what they did.
Right. But we also know that we've also now learned, again, this will all be evidence, no doubt, presented not by Congress, because Congress doesn't present evidence. The House will present evidence to convict. It's his lawyers that will present evidence, I presume, to acquit. The burden of proof is on those that are convicting, not the other way around. But we've also learned that a lot of this was planned long before that speech. We've also learned that, in fact, the riot itself started before the rally was over. So again, the burden of proof being on conviction. But back to the where the two intersect, the two issues we're discussing intersect, and that is, if 45 Republican senators, that is 45 senators, and I was one of them, believe that this isn't even a constitutional question, it's kind of hard to say you're going to vote to convict, even though you voted that it was unconstitutional to even bring this conviction to us. I would submit to you, Rob, it is more likely that some senator or more, one or more senators of the 55 who did want to hear the case, believe that it was constitutional be brought to the Senate, are likely to vote for acquittal. I think that's a more likely outcome than one of the 45 that voted that it was unconstitutional would vote to convict.
It at this point, and I mean, I understand people. Well, you can watch the speech, and maybe a lot of this was planned beforehand. And I don't want to get into litigating this too much, but
sure.
I mean, that speech wasn't the first time that President Trump said a lot of those things. One of the things that I really struggle with is, how do a bunch of people who are waving Trump flags, that are clearly Trump supporters, they got the MAGA hats on and all of that, and I mean, a lot of them have been arrested, so we can look at their political contributions now, we can look at their social media posts, we can look at their other types of activism. These were Trump's people. These were Trump supporters. And I don't understand how they came up with the idea to set up a gallows for Mike Pence, or to go charging into the Capitol that they're going to arrest Mike Pence, if the person that they're all waving the flags wasn't out there saying, Mike Pence is not doing his duty, or Mike Pence is gonna fail us, or whatever. How do they come up with that idea on their own if it doesn't come from Trump?
Well, do you think Donald Trump's the only person in America who could come up with that idea? I mean, that's as far a stretch as anything, to be honest. What was it, 75 million people or 175 million people, whatever the number is, 74 million people that voted for him, any one of them could be smarter than Donald Trump and could have come up with that idea. So I again, remembering that the burden of proof on conviction is on those making the accusation. That's the burden of proof, not the other way around. And you reference things like norms and shameful and all of those things. You're right. He's a violation of norms. So much of what he said is shameful. I think the most shameful thing is the point you're on right now, and that is the implication or implying somehow that Mike Pence had it within his constitutional authority to reject electors, or that the United States Senate had it, the Congress had the authority to reject electors. I believe that's as clear a reading of the Constitution as my reading that we don't impeach private citizens is. So it cuts both ways as long as you're consistent. And what's really at stake here, in my view, and I think it's really important that we, at least for me, that I try to remain consistent with this. And we know that circumstances dictate lots of things, and in the electoral office, the people you work for, are a determining factor. However, what is at issue here is the presidency itself, the institutions of Congress, the House and the Senate themselves. That stuff's what's at issue as much as Donald Trump. It's got to be less about Donald Trump and more about the institutions of government. And I often like to go back to that speech, the very first major speech that Abraham Lincoln ever gave on the perpetuation of the institutions of politics. He gave it when he was 28 years old, because he could see what was coming in terms of mob rule over the slavery issue long before he was, even considered being a candidate for president, or at least as far as we know. And certainly, 30 some years before, or 27 years, something like that, before his assassination, was already talking about this very issue, that we've got to keep our focus on the institutions, that being the Constitution, that being the separation of powers, that being, the Congress itself and the presidency itself.
I mean, to me, that's why consequences for Trump's behavior are so important. And maybe this leads a little bit into the next question I wanted to ask you. But I mean, we have the executive branch that was imploring the legislative branch to do something that you agree was unconstitutional. And then the president's supporters attacked the legislative branch. If that's not a clear attack on an institution and our institutional separation of powers, I don't know what is. And so this is my question. How much for you does President Trump's actions after or during and after the riot play into the case for conviction? Because to me, that is the most damning aspect. Is that, and again, we have the vice president's office confirmed. Vice President Pence was the one who ultimately called in the National Guard. We've heard from governors that the National Guard members were, it seemed at least for a while, that President Trump was content to let Congress be attacked.
Well, so you asked an important question with regard to a damning aspect. One of the things that is the most damning in all of this of the president's behavior, more than anything, frankly, was during and after. How late it was before he came, although it was that night before he came in front of a camera and called for peace. But also remembering that his speech that day called for a peaceful, patriotic protest at the Capitol itself, and it gets to that issue again of not just a damning aspect of the shamefulness or the extreme beyond the norms, but more importantly the criminal standard that becomes a high crime or misdemeanor, and that's the standard that we always have to look at. But I think one of the more damning things was his behavior during and then after, not just right after, for a few days after, that he was so slow to condemn, at least condemn in really the strongest terms, condemn the actions of the rioters. But again, none of that gets, in my view, and again, I'll hear all the evidence, but I don't default to conviction, or I wouldn't be a very good juror in America. I don't think that gets to conviction, I guess is my point. So, okay. We'll have to see.
So I mean, that's we talk in this is obviously there's an element of this. It's not exactly like the criminal justice system, but there's an element here where obviously you're the jury. There's been an indictment. There's going to be a trial.
Right.
In the criminal justice system, the evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a high bar for a lot of excellent reasons, and I'm happy for that bar to be exactly where it is. But it also means that sometimes we let people who are not very good people go. We let off people who were probably guilty of the crime, but because maybe the police botched the evidence or because there's a reasonable doubt, they go free. So in this instance, we have Donald Trump. You're saying that you don't like his actions, especially during and after the riot. But it doesn't rise to you to the level of conviction. Okay, fine. But you also just got a call recently about President Trump's desire to be continuously involved in the Republican Party. So how do you square those two things where you say, well, this is somebody who didn't act the way I would have wanted him to act when, and I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you even agreed with me, maybe acted shamefully, and you could correct me if I'm wrong there. How do you square that with somebody? I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I've been pretty hard on him.
Actually. Okay, you have. Yeah, I think you have. I just disagree. I think he should be convicted, but we've had that debate. Sure. But he also wants to continue to be involved in the Republican Party. And certainly, I mean, most Republicans in the base seem to want that too. If we look at public opinion polls, he's still got 80% approval among Republicans. Certainly I could just poll my own social media audience. People that I'm a communist and a traitor and everything else for I guess believing that President Trump was not a good president. How do you square those two things? Okay, so you don't think it was bad enough to be convicted, fine, but somebody who did that, you really think should continue to be a leader in the Republican movement?
Well, so Rob, remember this. I've said this many times, but the exceptionalism of our system is our self-governance. And you just cited polls that make it clear that he's going to be. And the phone call to me, by the way, was a very cordial, very encouraging, appreciative phone call that Republicans should all be very pleased with. I mean, some in the media have made it sound like it was a threatening phone call. It wasn't that at all. It was a very good call. And the self-governed nature, the exceptionalism of our system means he's going to be, if he's going to have as much influence probably as he wants to have, and it seems that he's going to have. So that's not really for me to determine how involved he's going to be, he's going to be. And you can't deny that. You can fight it if you want. If you're Mitt Romney, you can fight it. But, the people of Utah will have something to say about that part of it.
Sure.
With regard, though, to the conviction part of it, again, there is still the opportunity for, say, the United States Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia, to file inciting charges if they think that it meets that standard. The question I have, though, and the question I'm sort of pondering is, if in fact we were to convict Donald Trump, who's now been impeached twice. I mean, I've been in the Senate 2 years, and this is my second impeachment of the same person. What if what are we to do in 2 years from now if this becomes the new norm? That suddenly the standards are, well, he's violated the norms of the presidency, he's been shameful, his rhetoric is careless. I mean, I sit on the Veterans Affairs Committee in the Senate. We just had a hearing the day before yesterday, I guess it was, Wednesday, on Dennis McDonough, former chief of staff for Barack Obama, to be the VA secretary. I support his nomination, by the way. I like Dennis a lot. I have great hope that he'll do a great job. But in his hearing, he said, I'm a fighter. I'm going to fight like hell. I'll fight incessantly. I'll fight. I mean, he used the word fight more times than Byron Dorgan and Kent Conrad added up in all their TV ads over the decades. Am I to believe that he's going to take up arms against the bureaucracy if they don't serve our veterans? Well, of course not. Of course not. So I think what's going to be next in 2 years, if the Republicans take the House and the Senate, should the House bring up articles of impeachment on Joe Biden because he is so greatly busted the seams of the norms?
Yeah, I mean, all politicians have done that. I'm sure that I have at times, used words like fight or whatever when I'm clearly mean them figuratively. I not actually, I'm talking about there's a fight in the legislature. I don't mean that people are socking each other in the nose. I just mean they're arguing, they're debating. That's their job. Right. It's an adversarial process, and it's intended to be. And I mean, you have stuff like former President Obama said, something about bringing a knife to a gunfight or something. I mean, people say that. Like he doesn't mean it literally. I don't think President Obama literally wanted people to be stabbed or shot or anything. Yeah. But there's no denying that. No, President Obama's supporters never attacked the Capitol. That's the tough thing to get around. But let's. You said something interesting a moment ago. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole again. You said something interesting a moment ago that President Trump is going to have as much influence on the Republican Party as he wants to have, and
until we push back, until the Republicans don't agree.
Right. Anymore. So obviously the Republican base right now in this moment in time is okay with that. Mm-hmm. They clearly still very much like President Trump. Yep. Do you think, though, that there's a role to play? Is it all just listening to the base? Is it all just – because we talk about that when the left does that all the time, that they're just listening to the far left base and they're not listening to everybody. I mean, isn't there a role – and Edmund Burke wrote about this, and I've written about it. I've used his words a few times, but he wrote about how elected officials and leaders owe the people their reason, not their obedience. So it's not necessarily just about, 80% of Republicans like Trump, so I guess we're just not ever going to say anything about Trump. And not that that's, you've obviously been critical of him at times. But I struggle with that a little bit. Like, it's just the base likes him, so we're just going to go with it. I mean, maybe the base is wrong. Large groups of people can often be wrong. Populists are, I mean, the thing about populism is they're usually pushing a popular idea that's usually kind of a dumb idea. Right? It's why we have all sorts of checks against populism, or did. A lot of them have been eroded over the years. But when our country was founded, we have all sorts of checks against populism. Because the job of leaders wasn't just to listen to what the mob wanted, because what the mob wants in a given moment is often wrong. So how do you square that? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. It's also why the founders were so wise in giving us 3 co-equal branches of government and 2 halves of the one equal branch, so that you had varying degrees of influence come from the people, and the people still are the main thing in the United States of America, and in our, again, self-governed form of democracy or democratic republic. But again, I'm not. When I say he'll have as much influence as he wants to have, if 80, I think the latest poll was 87% of Republicans support Donald Trump. That means he's going to have it. It doesn't matter whether I say he's not going to have it, or you say he's not going to have it, or he shouldn't have it, or
Sure.
it means he does have it.
Right.
And
but that doesn't
that's
have
what
to
I'm
be
saying.
a state of being. I mean, influential people speaking out and making the counter argument can change that. I mean, that's how the whole process works.
Yep, and influential people will and do, and they'll be former office holders, and all of that's fine. Which is to say why
Sure.
one thing you I don't think generally hear from me, at least not in the last several years. I don't whine about losing elections. Listen, I'm up for election in 4 years if I choose to be. And at that point, people will have the opportunity to go out, to run against me, go up against me in a primary. This is one of the reasons, Rob, that I like primaries versus conventions, because the people have a lot to say about it. Now, it's also the reason why some people think conventions are better, because they think there's a greater party discipline in a convention process than there is in a primary process. But even our party organization is in the state statutes. And in the federal statutes, in terms of how parties organize themselves, because at some point it has to start with the most fundamental grassroots part of our society. So yes, to your point, but I don't whine about it either.
Sure.
If I don't meet the standard you set for me, you don't have to vote for me. What I would say, though, and this is what frustrates a lot of people, especially including people who think there ought to be term limits for members of Congress, and I do not. By the way, I never have. I've always thought
I don't either. I think people should get what they voted for, good and hard.
Yeah, exactly right. And so anyway, you and I probably actually do agree a lot on this. I think your point is more like, what about leaders? Shouldn't they be speaking out more? On the other hand, if Donald Trump what
I'm worried is that President Trump's base is so vocal and so motivated that Republicans who might otherwise feel that Donald Trump is not a good leader for the party long term are keeping their mouths shut because they're afraid of the base. And I think this is a problem we talk about on the left all the time, that they're acting, pushing for very extreme or very radical policies, or pushing for, a lot of the conversations around Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I think, are exactly that, where she represents, I think I don't want to say a small, but a faction of the Democratic base that is not necessarily, they get catered to a lot. And I wonder if Republicans are going to do the same thing in catering to Trump supporters at a time when we should be speaking out and say, no, this is somebody who couldn't get reelected. He is a one-term president who is extremely divisive and is not going to help us grow the Republican Party or the conservative movement. I mean, right now we're talking about primarying other Republicans. Like, we're going to, we have Republican parties around the country. They're trying to censor Mitch McConnell. They're trying to censor Representative Liz Cheney, I should say. How is that going to grow? How is that going to grow the Republican movement? How is that going to make us a larger movement? So that maybe we could get to a point where a Republican president could win the popular vote as well as the Electoral College vote.
Sure. So good point. But the option to that would be for all of these Trump supporters to form a third party, which is why it was so important for me to receive that word from President Trump that that's not his intention. He is going to work within the Republican Party, because certainly that divides conservatives and the conservative movement and ensures the election of Democrats. Just like, by the way, Joe Biden. So I think about what's next if Republicans, for example, take back the House and the Senate, which we very well could do in 2 years, depending on how things go.
It gets overshadowed. It gets overshadowed, but Republicans picked up seats in the House.
Lots of seats. Yeah, and lots of legislatures as well.
Yeah.
And so that means we're going to even get more. And because of the census executive order the other day, Texas very well might pick up, ironically, 2 or 3 more Republican congressional districts because illegal immigrants will be counted in the census now.
Whoops.
And yeah, right. And so all of these actions always have consequences, which is why things are cyclical. So let's say we do this and we become a majority, and that means that for at least 2 years, Joe Biden has a majority of Republicans in the House and Senate. That House Republicans could bring up impeachment charges on him because he went well beyond the norms of executive orders. He's now at 40 or more in his first week of executive actions. Donald Trump was like 7 in the same time frame.
I don't know if impeachment is a solution, but we do need to do something about what needs to happen is Congress needs to govern. Because Congress is creating a vacuum into which these executive orders are happening. I mean, the president comes in and they sign, we're governing by executive order, and then Congress holds hearings and doesn't do much about it.
But do they? In other words, is congressional inaction a license for the president to take congressional action?
Because it is not.
That's inaction is in fact action.
That's true.
And that's right. So that's the problem. The founders made it hard on purpose. They didn't want Congress passing a whole bunch of things every single day. In fact, I sometimes think we still do too much. So my only point being that the result of that may be that, the result of this overaction by him with executive orders, him being President Biden, may very well help create a result of Republicans winning in 2 years.
Well,
and
there's been bad. I mean, President Obama came in and was very aggressive in the first years of his term, and we got the Tea Party movement, which then turned into Republican majorities in Congress. Jimmy Carter was a one-term president, and he resulted in Ronald Reagan. I think there are still far more Americans that describe themselves as conservative than liberal, and that's true even today, surprisingly. It may surprise some people, given how dominant our dominant cultural institutions do not lean that way, but Americans still lean that way. At least a plurality of them. And my misgivings, I've gone on about them ad nauseum. I don't like political movements and maybe I'll end with this and get your reaction to it because I've used up enough of your time. I don't want a political movement that is centered on a personality or a person. I want one that's centered on ideas. And I worry that the Trump movement is so much about Trump that we've forgotten ideas.
So it's an interesting point, because here's what's ironic to me. And I think you've written somewhat about this, or at least when I've read some of what you've written, I've found some interesting, threads there. And one of them is the fact that you couldn't create a greater irony than the libertarian movement liking Donald Trump. I mean, it confounds me. It absolutely confounds me. It is the absolute antithesis of he's the antithesis of libertarianism.
Yes.
Other than religious liberties and certain things like that, which I appreciate about him a lot. Even his emphasis on states' rights. There are a lot of things that are similar, but by and large, he's clearly not, in my view, libertarian.
No,
and yet the libertarians have found a champion in him because he's a China buster. You know what I mean? And I don't mean the country. I mean he breaks the China.
Yeah, well, I think for a certain sort of angry American who was just upset at the status quo, he was a wrecking ball. But maybe we come full circle back to the people who are buying stock in a dying game retailer. Yep. It's an expression of anger. They're going to lose in the long term, and maybe they're okay with that. But there's a point at which, how much are we willing to lose to just hurt other people?
This experiment, by the way, and I know we'll go back to how we started, because I think it's a great philosophical discussion about populism and even liberalism and the juxtaposition of the two in this current scenario that you're drawing out. The collective loss of a bunch of small retail investors on Reddit may be affordable to them, and may devastate one or two hedge funders. But I suspect these,
devastate may be.
Do it every day.
Depending on the person, right? Devastate may be a relative term. I mean, they may have to sell off a house in the Hamptons or something. But
yeah, there you go. I hear you. Anyway, I think it's a fascinating discussion, Rob. Very few people will have it to the depth that you and I have just had it. But it'll be debated for a long, long time whether Donald Trump is a personality movement or an ideal movement. But I will say this: there is something back to this strain of populism that that will change the Republican Party for a long time, with or without Donald Trump, regardless of how active he himself as the person and the personality remains in our party, because it is what brought the working class American into the fold of the Republican Party.
I don't think Donald Trump invented any of this. I think he capitalized on it because I think he's a very astute person in that way. But he didn't create these things. I think he just talked about them in a way that captivated a lot of people and the idea. But that's part of why I don't want him to lead the movement, because when Trump's part of it, all we talk about is Trump. And what we should be talking about is, why do American workers feel this way? Why do people in rural America feel this way? We are not talking about that nearly enough. And I do not think that President Trump is the effective messenger for that. But
nope, but he was effective enough to create a movement that elected him president of the United States. So now all of a sudden we have this big personality that keeps these issues to the forefront. And one of the things, and I've said this to my friends, my really close friends, that don't agree with me on a lot of things. If you think the Republican Party in one election is going to go back to the Bush era,
well, they're not.
Globalism, it's not. No. And if you do not think that's where we're going.
Nor should we. I mean, during the 2018 campaign, I had a reckoning with my own. I had always bought into the idea that we'll free trade with China, and that will eventually bring China around, right? Which Republicans and Democrats agree. I mean, I had quotes from Bill Clinton. I had quotes from the Bushes. We all believed it back then. Rush Limbaugh believed it back then. We thought that free trade was going to be the way to go. And you know what? At least in China, I'm still a free market person. I still believe in free trade, but I think China's proved that we can't just cling to that ideology and hope it all works out, because China's used our free trade as a fuel cell for one of the worst authoritarian regimes has ever been seen in human history. So, we've got to be cognizant. We can't just hide our heads in the sand. I mean, when we're in a place where, professional sports athletes will rail about, because they have First Amendment protections, will rail about what a terrible place the United States is, but can't muster any criticism of communist China, we have a problem.
Yeah, or if you have big tech companies and social media companies that'll ban the speech of Donald Trump and Mike Lindell, but
or big financial companies that'll stick it to small investors if they're not behaving the right way. I mean, we need some conversations about who's holding the reins. But Kevin, I've used up all my time with you. I appreciate it every time we're on, and good luck.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rob. Keep getting well. Glad to hear you.